The man didn't even look at her when he said it. He was leaning against the stagecoach wheel, picking dirt from under his thumbnail with a knife. And when Margaret Whitmore climbed down from the coach with her bag clutched to her chest and sweat darkening the back of her dress, he looked up just long enough to take her in, all of her. And then he laughed, not a chuckle, a real open-mouthed laugh, the kind that turns heads. "Well, hell," Cole Mercer said, loud enough for his two men to hear. "They sending us cargo now?" His riders laughed. One of them said something she couldn't catch, but she caught enough, wide load, and the laughter doubled. Maggie stood in the Wyoming dust with her father's accounting journal pressed against her ribs and told herself she would not cry. She had promised herself that on the train out of Boston. She had promised herself that in every rattling hour of this stagecoach. She was not going to cry. She didn't. But she also didn't know yet that the man laughing at her was about to put a gun in her face. If you've ever been in a room where everyone laughed at you and you had to just stand there and take it, stay with this story. Because this is about a woman who took it and took it and took it and then stopped taking it entirely. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet and hit that like button. Then drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Maggie's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. Margaret Whitmore had not planned to be in Wyoming at all. 3 months earlier, she had been in Boston, sitting in the offices of Hargrove and Associates on a Tuesday morning, listening to a man in a good suit explain to her, slowly, patiently, the way men explain things to women they did not respect, that her father's estate had been entirely consumed by debt. The house, the furniture, the small investment account she had not known about until it was gone. All of it. "There is," the man said, setting down his pen, "a small personal account your father maintained separately. $41 and some change." Maggie sat very still. "The journal," she said. "The accounting ledger he kept. That's mine." The lawyer looked at her the way people had been looking at her since she was 12 years old and grew in every direction at once, while the other girls stayed neat and contained. It was a look that calculated and dismissed simultaneously. "Of course," he said. "That's yours." She walked out of that office carrying the journal and $41 and her good wool coat, which was already showing at the elbows. She walked 4 blocks before she sat down on a bench and let herself think. Her mother had died when Maggie was 7. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, who had taught her double-entry bookkeeping at the kitchen table the way other fathers taught their daughters embroidery, had died 6 weeks ago of a heart that had been working too hard for too long. She was 28 years old. She had no siblings, no husband, no prospects in a city where she had already been quietly passed over by every family that might have offered her a position as a governess or household manager, always for the same unspoken reason she could read in their faces as clearly as a balance sheet. She was too large, too plain, too much. Boston, she had long understood, had a specific idea of what a woman should look like and what she should take up, physically, spatially, socially. And Maggie Whitmore exceeded every one of those measurements. She had spent years trying to make herself smaller in every way that wasn't physical, quieter, less opinionated, more agreeable. It hadn't worked. She was still too much of herself for a city that wanted her to be less. So when she saw the advertisement 2 weeks after her father's funeral, seeking experienced cook and bookkeeper for remote cattle operation, Wyoming territory, room and board provided, monthly wage $20, she had written the letter the same night. She did not let herself think too hard about it. Thinking too hard was what had kept her in Boston 6 years longer than she should have stayed. She received a reply within the week. A brief letter, signed by one R. Dunmore, describing the position and the ranch and the stage route she should take from Cheyenne west into the territory. The letter was businesslike and direct, which she appreciated. No questions about her appearance, no request for a photograph, which every domestic employment agency in Boston had started requiring and which had cost her 3 positions before she understood why. She wrote back accepting the offer. She spent $37 of her $41 on a train ticket. She kept $4 for the stagecoach and whatever came after. She did not tell anyone she was leaving because there was no one left to tell. The stagecoach west from Cheyenne carried 5 passengers and a strongbox that the driver did not mention, but that everyone could hear shifting against the footboard on every curve. There was a traveling salesman who smelled of bay rum and talked without pause for the first 2 hours. There was a young couple, recently married by the look of them, sitting pressed together and speaking in low voices that Maggie tried not to hear. There was an older man in a cattleman's hat who slept with his chin on his chest from the first mile and did not wake until they stopped to change horses. And there was Maggie. She sat with the journal in her lap and watched Wyoming come at her through the coach window. She had expected it to feel foreign. Instead, it felt like something she had no category for, vast and indifferent and brutally honest in the way that landscapes can be when there is nothing between you and the horizon. Boston was a city that made you feel either included or excluded. This was something else. This was a place that simply did not care either way. She found that almost comforting. The attack came on the second afternoon in a stretch of high plain where the road cut between two rock formations, and the driver had to slow to navigate the grade. Maggie heard the shot before she understood what it was. Then she heard the driver shout, and then the coach lurch sideways as the horses panicked, and then everything was noise and movement, and the traveling salesman pressing himself against the far wall with both arms over his head. The coach stopped hard. Outside, men were shouting. The cattleman in the hat was already awake, his hand inside his coat, but when the door was pulled open from outside, what came in first was a gun barrel, and then the face of a man who had the particular expression of someone who did this often enough that it no longer required emotion. "Strongbox," the man said. The driver, from somewhere above, said something conciliatory. The voice of someone trying to manage a situation he knew he had already lost. Maggie sat still. Her hands were flat on the cover of the journal. She was aware with strange precision of the weight of the bag at her feet. Her clothing, her father's letters, the small folding knife she had bought at a hardware store in Cheyenne for reasons she hadn't fully articulated to herself. The man with the gun looked at each passenger in turn. He did not speak again until his eyes reached Maggie. Then the expression changed. Not to cruelty exactly, to amusement. "You!" He jerked the barrel at her. "Out!" "Why?" she said. The salesman made a sound like a compressed breath. The young wife's hand tightened on her husband's arm. The man with the gun blinked. He was not accustomed to why. "Because I said so," he said. "That's not a reason," Maggie said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know why it was steady. Her heart was doing something violent inside her chest, but her voice had decided on its own to stay level. The man stared at her for a moment. Then he stepped back and shouted for someone, and a second man appeared, and together they pulled her out of the coach and into the afternoon light. There were three of them, the one who had been inside, a second one by the horses, which had been caught and held, and a third leaning against a rock formation with his thumbs in his belt, tall, dark-haired, watching the whole scene with an expression of mild interest, the way a man watches something he organized but no longer needs to involve himself in. This was Cole Mercer, though Maggie did not know his name yet. He looked at her and he laughed. "Well, hell," he said. "They sending us cargo now?" The two other men laughed. Maggie stood in the dust with the journal clutched to her chest. Her bag was still in the coach. She had nothing except what she was holding and what she was wearing, and the knife in the bag she no longer had access to. She looked at Mercer directly. She had learned a long time ago that looking away made things worse. "What do you want?" she said. He walked toward her slowly, the way men did when they were making a performance of something, wanting the audience, his men, the people in the coach, to appreciate it. "What have you got?" he said. "An accounting journal and a used train ticket." He stopped in front of her. He was a good-looking man in a rough way, the kind of good-looking that knew itself and used it. His eyes moved over her with that calculating dismissal she recognized, the same calibration she had endured her entire life. But here it was combined with something else, something that made her stomach drop. "No money?" he said. "No." "No jewelry?" "No." He reached out and put his hand on the journal. She felt the pull of it, him testing whether she would let go. She did not let go. His eyes came up to her face. He was smiling. "You know what?" he said. "I believe you. You got nothing worth taking." He pulled his hand back. "So here's what's going to happen. We're taking the strongbox and the horses. Coach isn't going anywhere. You want to walk, you walk. You want to wait, you wait." He leaned in close enough that she could smell tobacco and sweat. "And you don't say a word to anyone about what direction we went, because if you do," he patted his holster, "we'll have ourselves another conversation." He stepped back. "Understood?" he said. Maggie held the journal and said nothing. Mercer waited a moment, apparently satisfied by her silence, then turned and walked back to his men. They worked efficiently. The strongbox down from the coach, the horses cut loose, the driver and passengers left standing in the road with no means to go anywhere at all. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. Then they were gone. The sound of hooves faded. The silence that replaced it was enormous. The driver was a practical man named Hicks, who had survived 2 prior robberies and treated this one with the methodical calm of someone running through a familiar checklist. He confirmed the horses were truly gone. He confirmed the strongbox was gone. He noted that the coach itself was functional, but without means of locomotion. Nearest settlement's about 8 miles east, he said, back the way we came. The salesman asked about the settlement to the west, which was where they had been going. Closer to 14, Hicks said. The young couple decided to walk east. The salesman, after considerable deliberation, joined them. The cattleman in the hat, who had still said almost nothing, declared he would walk west because he had business there that wouldn't hold. Maggie looked at the road east and the road west and made the same calculation she always made, which was to ask herself what her father would have thought was the sensible choice. Her father would have said, "You have a job waiting. A job means money. Money means you have options. You walk toward the options." She walked west. She did not ask Hicks to wait. He couldn't wait. He had responsibilities in both directions and a livelihood to protect. He told her what landmarks to look for on the road to Calverton and which branches in the road to avoid, and she listened carefully and committed everything to memory. And then she walked. She had been walking for approximately 40 minutes, with the afternoon light going amber, and the temperature dropping in a way that Wyoming apparently did without any preliminary warning, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She stepped off the road and turned. A single rider. Coming from the west, not the east, which meant he hadn't been part of the robbery aftermath. She stood still and watched him come, and she thought about the knife in her bag and the bag on the coach, 8 miles behind her, and she thought about what Mercer had said. Another conversation. And she prepared herself for a version of that. The rider pulled up about 20 yards away. He was not Mercer. He was broader than Mercer, the working kind of broad that comes from actual labor rather than menace. His horse was good. She didn't know much about horses, but she could tell the difference between a working animal and a show one. He had a rifle across the saddle, but his hands were visible and not on it. He looked at her standing alone on the road with a journal and no bag, and the dust of the territory on her dress, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, exactly. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who understood that a person does not end up alone on a Wyoming road in the late afternoon by choice. "Ma'am," he said. "Don't," Maggie said. She was tired and frightened, and she had just walked 40 minutes in shoes that were not made for Wyoming roads, and she did not have the patience for careful social navigation. "I'm not injured, and I don't need rescuing. I need to get to Calverton. Is this the right road?" He looked at her for a moment. "It is," he said. "About 7 miles on." "Thank you," she said, and turned and kept walking. He didn't move. She heard the horse shift, heard the leather creak, and then heard him say, "Stage get hit?" She stopped. She turned back. "Yes," she said. "Mercer?" She blinked. "You know him?" Something went across his face, not surprise, but the familiar weight of something he had already been carrying. "His gang's been working this road for 3 weeks, the man said. "Everyone knows it. Stage line should have held coaches until we cleared them out." He paused. "They take the strongbox?" "And the horses." He exhaled. It was a specific kind of exhale. The exhale of a man adding up a cost. "Anyone hurt?" "No." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I can take you to Calverton. It's on my way." She wanted to say no. She had been practicing saying no her entire life, to people who offered help that came attached to judgment, to people who offered charity that was really just condescension with better manners. She was very good at saying no. "You heading to Calverton?" she said. "Close to? Iron Ridge Ranch, few miles past." She thought about 7 miles of Wyoming road in thinning light. "Thank you," she said. "I accept." He held down a hand to help her up, and she looked at it for a moment because she wasn't used to people offering her their hand without making something of it, and then she took it and got up behind him with more difficulty than she would have liked because the horse was tall and her body was not designed for this kind of maneuver. and to his credit, he did not comment on any of it. Nathaniel Callahan, he said. Nate. Margaret Whitmore, she said. Maggie. He turned the horse west, and they rode. She asked him, after a while, whether Mercer's gang was likely to be caught. Deputy Sheriff's been chasing them since June, Nate said. Makes progress, loses it. They move fast. They took the coach horses, Maggie said. That should slow them down. He considered that. It would. 6 horses is a lot of animals to manage. They can't move quietly with 6 extra horses they didn't plan for. If the deputy knows where they've been selling stock. She stopped herself. She had a habit of thinking out loud that people found either interesting or irritating, with no middle ground. Go on, Nate said. She wasn't sure if he was humoring her. She kept going anyway. If they've sold horses from previous jobs at the same place, which would be the efficient choice, then they'll go there again. That's where you'd wait. Not on the road. At the buyer. There was a pause. You figured that out on a horse in the dark, Nate said. I figured it out about a mile back, Maggie said. I was deciding whether to say it. He didn't respond for a moment, and then he said, Deputy's office is in Calverton. You could tell them. I will, she said. They rode in silence for a while. Wyoming at dusk was something she couldn't have prepared for. The light going in colors she didn't have names for, the land stretching out in every direction as if the earth was demonstrating something about its own scale. In Boston, the sky was always interrupted. Here it was uninterrupted, a different experience of the same sky. What brings you to Calverton? He said. A job, she said. Cook and bookkeeper, at a cattle ranch west of town. He didn't respond immediately. She had learned to notice hesitations. This one meant something. Which ranch? He said. Iron Ridge, she said. Another hesitation. Smaller, but she caught it. Who'd you correspond with? He said. Someone named R. Dunmore. The only sound for a moment was the horse's hooves on the road. Randall Dunmore, Nate said. My foreman. Maggie felt something go cold and careful in her chest. Is that a problem? He didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. It might be, he said. Let's get to the ranch. I'll know more then. She wanted to press him. Every instinct she had said to press him. But she was behind him on a borrowed horse in the dark, in a territory she didn't know, and she had $4 to her name, and she understood that some conversations needed to happen on stable ground. She kept her mouth shut and her journal tight against her ribs, and watched the darkness come. What? Iron Ridge Ranch was larger than she had imagined from the letter, which had been businesslike and unimpressive. There were several outbuildings she could make out by lantern light, a main house of considerable size for a working ranch, and the sound and smell of cattle from somewhere in the surrounding dark. Men were moving between buildings as they rode in, and the activity slowed and changed quality as she and Nate came into the yard. That specific stillness of people stopping to look at something unexpected. She knew that stillness. She had been the cause of it before. Nate swung down and reached up to help her, and she took his hands and got down with the same lack of grace as getting up. And she stood in the yard while the men in the surrounding area looked at her with the full range of expressions she had catalogued over the years. Amusement, confusion, assessment, dismissal. One man said something low to another. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone, and she caught the other man's laugh. Nate either didn't hear it or chose not to. He said, "Come inside," and held the door. Randall Dunmore was in the main room when they entered, a wiry man in his 50s with a foreman's bearing and the careful expression of someone who'd heard the horse come in and had been arranging his face ever since. He looked at Maggie. He looked at Nate. "You found her," he said, which was not quite the right thing to say. "The stage got hit by Mercer's gang," Nate said. "She was walking the road." He paused. "You want to tell me about the letter you sent?" Dunmore's careful expression adjusted incrementally. "Ranch needs a bookkeeper," he said. "You've been saying it for 2 years." "That's not an answer, Randall." "She's here," Dunmore said. "Position's available." "Is it?" Nate said. A silence developed that had specific dimensions, the shape of something 2 men had discussed before and not resolved. Maggie stood inside that silence and understood its components. Nate had not authorized the advertisement. Dunmore had acted on his own assessment of what the ranch needed. The position had been offered without full authority. which meant she had spent $37 in 4 days on a train and 2 days in a coach and 40 minutes on a Wyoming road on the basis of an offer that might not be real. She put the journal under her arm. "I don't need anyone to decide this for me," she said. Both men looked at her. "I came here for a job," she said. "Bookkeeper and cook. I can cook adequately. I'm not exceptional, but I'm consistent and I don't waste food. More importantly, I can manage accounts. I've been doing it since I was 14. If your records are in reasonable order, I can confirm that in an hour. If they're not in reasonable order," she glanced at Dunmore because she suspected the answer, "I can tell you exactly what's wrong with them and what it'll cost you by end of year if no one fixes them." Nate looked at her for a moment. "The records," he said, "are not in reasonable order." "Then you need me," she said, "unless you'd rather keep losing money." Dunmore's expression had evolved into something she couldn't quite read. Partly offended, partly impressed, partly something that looked like vindication. Nate Callahan looked at Margaret Whitmore, travel-dirty, journal-clutching, standing in his main room in shoes that had not been built for the West, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, 30 days. 30 days, she said. "You show me what you can do in 30 days. Show me the books," she said, "and I'll show you tonight." Something shifted in his expression. She could not have said exactly what. He went to a desk in the corner and came back with a ledger that looked the way ledgers looked when no one who genuinely understood them had touched them in a long time. She sat down at the table without waiting to be invited, opened it, and began reading. The room was quiet. Dunmore leaned against the wall and watched. Nate stood by the desk. Outside, the sounds of the ranch continued. Men moving, cattle distant, a horse coughing in a stable. And Maggie Whitmore, who had come west with $4 and her father's accounting journal, and $37 in sunk costs, and a dead father's belief that numbers never lied, began finding the lies hidden in Nate Callahan's books. She found the first one in 4 minutes. She found the second before she finished her second page. By the time she looked up 40 minutes later, she had found 9 separate discrepancies and could see the shape of at least 4 more that would need the previous year's records to confirm. Nate was still standing by the desk. He had not, she realized, left the room. "Your supply costs are being inflated," she said, "consistently, about 11% across grain and feed purchases over the past 8 months. Either your supplier is overcharging and no one is comparing invoices to delivery receipts, or someone here is taking the difference." She set the ledger down. "Also, your cattle count in July doesn't reconcile with the June figure, and you're missing 53 head on paper that presumably exists somewhere in the physical world, which means either there's been undocumented sale or the count is wrong." Nate was very still. "Which do you think it is?" he said. "I'd need the receipts and the delivery records," she said, "and I'd need to talk to whoever handles the purchasing. But if I had to guess at this moment," she looked at him steadily, "I'd say it's both." Dunmore had gone very quiet in his corner. Nate looked at her for a long moment. "Room's off the kitchen," he said. "Small, but private. Meals at 5:30. "I'll need this previous year's ledger," she said, "and the receipt box, wherever you keep it. I'll have Dunmore bring them." She nodded. She was careful, very careful, not to look at Dunmore directly. Not because she was afraid of him, because she didn't want to give away. Yet, what she already suspected about Randall Dunmore, and the gap between the supply costs and the delivery records, and a pattern that she had seen before in her father's business when she was 16, and had recognized then even before she knew what it meant. She stood up, tucked the journal under her arm, and said, "Good night." She found the room off the kitchen. It was indeed small, barely enough for the cot and the small chest that were its only furnishings. And she sat on the cot in the dark because she didn't know where the lamp oil was kept and was not going to go back and ask. She sat in the dark with the journal in her hands, and she let herself think about what she had just walked into. A job that might not be legitimate, offered by a foreman who had reasons of his own. A ranch with financial problems that someone was possibly creating deliberately. A ranch owner who was either aware and helpless or unaware and about to be very unhappy. And tomorrow, all of this would still be here, and she would have to navigate it without allies and without money and without anything except the skills her father had spent 12 years putting into her head. She thought about her father, who had believed until the end that the world rewarded careful, honest work. She thought about Boston, where it hadn't. She thought about Wyoming, where the jury was still very much out. Then she lay down on the cot in her traveling clothes because it was cold and she had nothing else, and she fell asleep with the journal on her chest like armor. Outside, the ranch went on doing what ranches did. The night sounds, the cattle, the wind that came off the high plain and found every gap in the walls. And nobody who moved through those sounds that night had any particular thought about the woman in the room off the kitchen who had spent the last 4 minutes finding, in their ledger, the beginning of a truth that someone had spent 8 months trying to hide. She woke before 5. Not because anyone knocked, or because the ranch made any sound different from the sounds it had been making all night, but because her body had developed, over years of uncertain circumstances, the habit of waking early in unfamiliar places. It was a survival instinct dressed up as a schedule. The room off the kitchen was exactly as cold as it had been when she fell asleep, possibly colder. The cot had a single blanket that was adequate in the way that things are adequate when you have no basis for comparison and no other option. She lay still for a moment, looking at the low ceiling, and let the previous day assemble itself in her mind in the correct order. Boston, the train, the stagecoach, Mercer's face, the road, the horse, Nate Callahan, the ledger, 9 discrepancies, and a room so small she could touch both walls if she stretched. She sat up. She had slept in her traveling clothes, and her hair had done what hair does when it is pinned up on a train for 4 days, and then slept on without repinning, which was to say it had developed opinions of its own. She did what she could with it by feel in the dark, found the pitcher on the chest that someone, she hadn't heard them come in, had filled with water overnight, washed her face, and opened the door to the kitchen. The kitchen was not in good order. This was her first thought, before coffee, before anything else. A kitchen told you things about a household the same way a ledger told you things about a business. The gaps, the habits, the places where someone had given up, and the places where someone had never tried. This kitchen told her that meals were produced through a combination of stubbornness and improvisation by whoever drew the short lot on any given morning, that the dry goods were stored without any organizing logic, that the previous cook, if there had been one, had either left suddenly or had not been the kind of person who wiped down surfaces when they finished. She found the coffee, found the pot, found wood for the stove that had been stacked just outside the back door with more conscientiousness than anything inside, and she started a fire. While she waited for the water to heat, she went back to the ledger, which she had brought from the room, and the receipt box, which Dunmore had indeed left on the kitchen table the previous night without comment or knock. The receipts were worse than the ledger. Not because there were too few of them. There were plenty. The problem was the ones that were missing. She could see their shadows in the ledger entries, line items that referenced deliveries with no corresponding paper trail, payments made to suppliers who appeared in no other record. It was the kind of absence that looked like disorganization on the surface and looked like something else entirely once you knew what to look for. Her father had taught her, Maggie, an honest mistake leaves a mess. A dishonest one leaves a specific kind of clean. This had a specific kind of clean to it. She was writing in her own small notebook. She always carried one, a habit from her father. When the kitchen door opened and a boy of about 15 came in, stopped when he saw her, and stared. "Morning," she said without looking up. "You're the—" he started. "Cook and bookkeeper," she said. "Yes, coffee's almost ready. Are you on breakfast duty?" "Yeah," he said. "Usually just me. Walt." "Walt," she said. "How many men are we feeding?" "Depends, between 12 and 14 most mornings." She closed the notebook and looked at what was available. "Do we have eggs?" "Chickens are out back." "Go get them," she said. "All of them. And find out if there's salt pork. I saw a smokehouse from the yard last night." He went. He did not argue, which she appreciated. She had half expected argument. She was new, she was female, she was large, she was none of the things the ranch was accustomed to. But Walt was 15 and apparently willing to take direction from whoever was standing in the kitchen with authority and coffee. She had learned that much about authority a long time ago. It was not about size or title or the particular way you stood. It was about the quality of certainty in your voice when you said a thing. She had that quality. She had practiced it. By 5:30, when the ranch hands came in from the first morning work, there were eggs and salt pork and biscuits that were not beautiful, but were hot and plentiful, and there was enough coffee for everyone with some left over. She stood at the stove and did not look up when they came in, and she heard the shift in conversation when they registered her presence. The drop in volume, the murmured comments, a laugh she was not meant to hear that she heard clearly. She kept her eyes on the pan. A man she didn't know sat down at the end of the table and said, loudly enough to be intended for her, "Walt, what happened to Rosa?" "Rosa quit in August," Walt said from beside the stove. "So what's this?" "New cook," Walt said. He said it simply, without editorializing, which she appreciated more than she would have expected from a 15-year-old. "She know how to cook?" the man said. "Eat something and find out," Maggie said, and put a plate in front of him. There was a silence. Then another man laughed. Different tone, genuine amusement rather than meanness, and picked up his fork. The first man picked up his fork too, because there was nothing else to do. And he ate, and he did not complain about the food, which told her everything she needed to know about whether the food was acceptable. Nate Callahan came in at 6:10. He sat at the head of the table the way he clearly always sat, without fuss, and accepted a plate without comment. He ate in the methodical way of a man who thought of meals primarily as fuel, which was a working man's relationship with food. He was reading something while he ate, a piece of paper, not the ledger, something he'd brought with him. He didn't speak to her until he was almost done. "Sleep all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Your receipt records for the last 8 months need to be cross-referenced with the delivery logs from whoever you have on supply runs. Do you have those logs?" He looked up from his paper. "Good morning," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Good morning. Do you have the delivery logs?" Something almost happened at the corner of his mouth. "Dunmore handles that." "I'll need to talk to Dunmore," she said. The table had gone slightly quieter around them. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a room's temperature. "After breakfast," Nate said. "After breakfast," she agreed. Dunmore was not easy to find after breakfast. She asked Walt, who said he'd seen him heading toward the equipment barn. She found the equipment barn, a long, dark structure that smelled of oil and metal and animal. And Dunmore was not in it. A man named Cleet, who was working on a wagon wheel with the focused irritation of someone who had been at it too long, said Dunmore had passed through and gone on toward the north pasture. She did not go to the north pasture. She went back to the kitchen, got the receipt box, and began building a separate ledger of her own, a clean one, in the back pages of her notebook, where she could track what the records said against what the records implied. She was 40 minutes into this when Dunmore appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at what she was doing on the table. He looked at the receipt box, open, receipts sorted into 3 separate piles. "You said you'd need to talk to me," he said. "I do," she said. "Sit down." He didn't sit down immediately. He stood in the doorway with his thumbs in his pockets, and she understood that this was a man deciding how to position himself relative to a situation he had created and was not sure he controlled anymore. Then he sat. "Supply purchases," she said, "the grain and feed invoices. I'm seeing invoices from a supplier called Breckenridge Dry Goods, 8 separate entries totaling $112 over 6 months. But I can't find any delivery records for Breckenridge, and I can't find Breckenridge in any of the earlier records, which would suggest they're a new supplier. Do you have a contract with them?" Dunmore looked at the receipts. "They're reliable," he said. "I didn't ask if they were reliable," she said. "I asked if you have a contract." "Not every supplier does contracts," he said. "Out here, it's handshake business mostly." "Who receives the deliveries from Breckenridge?" "Usually me," he said, "or whoever's available." "Is there a name on Breckenridge? An owner? An address?" A beat. "Bill Mercer handles it," he said. "Out of Calverton." She wrote the name in her notebook. She did not look up when she wrote it. She had learned that people said more when you weren't looking at them. "Any relation," she said, pen still on paper, "to Cole Mercer?" The silence was brief, but it was there. "Common name," Dunmore said. She looked up. Dunmore's face was doing several things at once: managing, calculating, assessing how much she had and how much she was guessing. It was a complicated face. She had seen that kind of face before, on people who were in between things, not fully committed to dishonesty but not fully honest either, occupying the useful middle ground of a man who told himself he hadn't done anything actually wrong. She held his gaze and said nothing. "You're good at your job," Dunmore said finally. "I know," she said. That wasn't a compliment exactly. I know that too, she said. I'll need the delivery logs from the last 12 months. Any you have. If they're in the north pasture, I'll wait. He was quiet for a moment. I'll get them, he said. He left. She sat at the table and listened to the kitchen settle around her. The fire in the stove, the wind outside, the sound of men and horses in the yard. And she thought about a name. Bill Mercer, Calverton, Breckenridge, Dry Goods. She thought about a gang that had been working the territory roads for 3 weeks, stealing strongboxes and horses. She thought about the shape of an 11% inflation across 6 months of supply purchases, and she thought about the specific kind of clean that dishonesty leaves behind. She thought about what her father would say. He would say, "Be sure before you say a thing, because once you say it, you can't unsay it." She wasn't sure yet. She had enough to be suspicious, not enough to be certain. She needed the delivery logs, and she needed to know whether any of the ranch hands had noticed anything irregular about the supply deliveries, and she needed to talk to Nate Callahan in a way that was not at the breakfast table with 14 people within earshot. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook and started writing a list of everything she needed to confirm. She had the habit of writing lists, too. Her father had called it organized thinking made visible. She called it not trusting herself to keep track of everything in her head, which was just honesty. The delivery logs arrived mid-afternoon. Dunmore dropped them on the kitchen table while she was preparing the evening meal without a word and left again. She cooked with one hand and read with the other, which was not efficient and not elegant, but was effective. And by the time Walt came to help her with service, she had found what she was looking for. Breckenridge Dry Goods had 3 delivery records in the logs. 3, not 8. The ledger showed 8 payments. The difference, 5 phantom invoices, approximately $63, was not a bookkeeping error. Bookkeeping errors were sloppy. This was precise. Whoever had generated those 5 false entries had done it with the confidence of someone who did not expect anyone to look this closely, which told her that no one had been looking this closely, probably for longer than 8 months. She sat down on a kitchen stool and thought about Randall Dunmore, who had written a letter to an accounting journal in Boston and offered a job that technically was not his to offer, and she thought about whether he had done it because he genuinely believed the ranch needed help or because he had underestimated what help might look like when it arrived. Possibly both. People were capable of both simultaneously. She had learned that much about people. She told Nate that evening. She waited until the yard was quiet and the hands were settled and knocked on the door of his office, which was off the main room. A small space with a desk and a wall of pegs holding various working things, and a window that looked out toward the dark outline of the eastern hills. He was still at the desk. She was not surprised. 5 phantom invoices, she said, and set her notebook in front of him, open to the page where she had written the comparison. 3 entries in the delivery logs, 8 entries in the ledger, each one with a precise amount and a supplier name. $63 at minimum. That's what I can confirm tonight. If the pattern holds, and I think it does, there may be similar arrangements with other suppliers I haven't cross-referenced yet. Nate looked at the notebook for a long time. She had expected him to react with some kind of visible emotion, anger, maybe, or the particular tightness of a man whose trust has been used against him. What she got was something quieter, and she thought worse. The expression of a man who had suspected something and was now finding out the shape of it. "Dunmore," he said. It was not a question. "The entries are in his handwriting," she said. "I can't speak to whether he acted alone or whether the supplier is involved." "Bill Mercer," Nate said. "You know him." "I know of him." He sat back. "He's Cole Mercer's brother." The room was quiet for a moment. "So the gang robs on the road," she said, working it as she spoke, "and the brother skims from supply contracts on the inside. And my foreman—" Nate stopped. She waited. "I've known Randall Dunmore for 11 years, he said. She did not say anything to that. There was nothing useful she could say. She had never known anyone for 11 years who then turned out to be stealing from her. But she understood from the way he said it that this was not a fact she needed to add weight to. "I don't know yet what arrangement he has with the Mercers," she said. "It might be that they approached him. It might be that he approached them. The financial evidence tells me what happened. It doesn't tell me how or why." "Does it matter?" he said. "It might," she said. "If he was coerced, the situation is different than if he volunteered. Not legally, perhaps, but practically. He looked at her. Where'd you learn to think like that? He said. My father, she said. He was an accountant, and he believed that context didn't excuse behavior, but it explained it, and explanations are useful even when they're not comforting. Nate was quiet. What do you need, he said, to build a complete picture? 2 more days with the records, she said, and I need to know whether anyone else on the ranch has a relationship with the Mercers. Dunmore might not be the only one. He nodded slowly. Do it quietly, he said. I intend to, she said. One more thing. She turned a page in the notebook. Your cattle count from July. The discrepancy I mentioned last night. 53 head missing on paper. I think I know where they went. He looked up. The same supply run structure, she said. There are sale records for cattle I can't match to any purchase order or buyer contract. Small lots, different names each time, nothing large enough to draw attention. Someone's been skimming stock the same way they've been skimming supply money, slowly, over time, in amounts that don't look like theft until you add them up. Nate Callahan put both hands flat on the desk and stared at the notebook. She gave him time with it. She had found, over years of delivering difficult numbers to people, that what they needed most in the first moment was not solutions. They needed to absorb the size of the problem before they could think about addressing it. Total? He said. I'll have a firm number in 2 days, she said. My estimate right now is that Iron Ridge Ranch has lost between $400 and $600 over the past year from these 2 schemes alone. Possibly more. He exhaled slowly. $400 to $600 was not ranch-ending money for an operation this size. But it was real money, and more than that, it was the money of someone who had been inside the operation long enough to understand where to take from without being noticed. That was the damage that didn't show up in ledgers. The knowledge that trust had been systematically used as a tool against itself. You found all this in 1 day, he said. The first part in 1 evening, she said. The rest this afternoon. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down, and it was a different look than the one she'd been receiving since she arrived. From the ranch hands in the yard, from the men at the breakfast table, from Dunmore in the kitchen. Those looks had been assessing her size, her appearance, her right to be in their space. This look was assessing her, and it was the look of someone revising an estimate. 30 days, he said. Yes, she said. I'm starting to think 30 days is going to feel long, he said. She wasn't sure how to take that. She decided to take it at face value. I work fast when the problem is clear, she said. It's rarely this clear this quickly. She stood up, picked up her notebook, and said goodnight. The next morning, the murmuring started. She had expected something. She had not expected it quite this fast. By the time she was serving breakfast, she was aware that a conversation had been happening in the bunkhouse the night before. The kind of conversation that happens when something new arrives in a closed system and the closed system begins calibrating to it. The ranch hands were not, she found, a monolithic group. There were 8 full-time men, plus Walt, plus 2 seasonal workers who were there through the fall cattle work. They had their own hierarchy, their own alliances, their own grievances, all of which were invisible to her as a newcomer, but would become visible in time. What she was becoming aware of now was a fault line between the ones who were waiting to see what she could do and the ones who had already decided. The man who had asked about Rosa at that first breakfast was named Hobart. He was maybe 45, heavy-set in the manner of a man who had been lean and physical once, and was now carrying the evidence of years. He had a following among 3 of the other hands. Nothing formal, just the gravitational pull of a man who had been somewhere long enough to feel proprietary about it. On the 3rd morning, Hobart sat down across from Walt and said, loudly and without looking at Maggie, "You ask her about those biscuits?" "What about the biscuits?" Walt said. "They're flat." "They're fine," Walt said. "They're flat," Hobart said. "Rosa made better biscuits." "Rosa also left," Walt said. Maggie set a plate in front of Hobart. She did not say anything. She had learned, this was an old lesson, one of the first ones, that rising to a provocation gave the provocation more weight than it deserved. Hobart was not actually complaining about biscuits. He was establishing a position. The biscuits were just the language he had available. She went back to the stove. Hobart said, to the table in general, "Ranch has been running fine without a bookkeeper." "Ranch lost $600 last year," someone said, from the far end. Hobart looked up. The The someone was a younger man, mid-20s, reddish hair, who Maggie had learned was called Eddie, and who had been watching her work with the ledgers with the careful attention of someone who respected precision without necessarily understanding it. "Where'd you hear that?" Hobart said. "Around," Eddie said. "Around doesn't mean true," Hobart said. "Neither does around mean false," Eddie said. Maggie kept her back to the table. She ladled coffee and thought about the fact that information traveled in a closed system and that $600 was a number that meant something concrete to working men who knew exactly what they earned in a year. After breakfast, 3 of the hands found reasons to be near the kitchen while she was cleaning up. Not Hobart. 3 of the others, working nearby, within conversational range, but not invading the kitchen itself. She understood this as its own kind of inquiry, people figuring out whether she was safe to approach. She made the approach easy. She asked one of them, a quiet man named Purvis, who had a way of appearing wherever there was something heavy to carry, whether the north pasture fence needed repair, because she'd heard 2 men mention it and it would affect the cattle count. Purvis blinked. "Yeah," he said. "South end, been needing it 3 weeks. Who schedules repairs?" "Dunmore, usually." "Has he scheduled it?" Purvis looked at her with the expression of a man answering a question he already found interesting. "No," he said. She wrote it in her notebook. A fence unrepaired for 3 weeks in the area where cattle were unaccounted for on paper. It was not proof of anything, but it was another edge of the shape. By the end of her first week, Maggie had found what she estimated to be $780 in losses over 14 months, across 4 separate schemes: the phantom invoices, the cattle count manipulation, an undocumented arrangement with a transport contractor that was overbilling by a consistent 15%, and a smaller but consistent pattern of supply substitution where cheaper goods were ordered and the difference pocketed. She put the complete figures in front of Nate on Friday evening. He sat with the numbers for a long time. 14 months, he said. "That's as far back as the records go that I can cross-reference," she said. "The pattern may extend further." "It's Dunmore." "The majority of it points to Dunmore, yes. Some of it, the transport contractor, may be separate. I can't confirm." He stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her for a moment. "I hired him when I was 24, he said. "He knew this land better than I did, taught me half of what I know about running cattle." She sat with that. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with that information," she said. "That's not my job. My job is to give you accurate numbers." "What would you do?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. He had asked her a direct question, and she had a direct answer, and the question was whether this was the moment to give it. "I'd confront him privately," she said. "Give him the option to explain himself. Not because he deserves it. I don't know whether he does. Because you deserve to know if there's an explanation. 11 years is 11 years." He turned from the window. "And if there's no explanation, or not a good one, then you have a decision to make that I can't make for you," she said. "But the numbers will still be accurate either way." He nodded once. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to him tomorrow." He paused. "You've done more work in a week than I've seen done in—" He stopped. "You're good at this." "I know," she said. It came out flat, the way it always did when she said it. Not arrogant, just factual, the way her father had said things that were simply true. She watched him register it and decide it was honesty rather than vanity. "The 30 days, he said. "We can call that done." "I'll finish the records," she said. "I want to be thorough." He almost smiled. She noticed because it was not a full smile. It was the near miss of one, the kind of expression that happens when something surprises a face before the face decides what to do about it. "There's a room that's bigger than the one off the kitchen," he said. "End of the east wing. It's been empty." "The room off the kitchen is adequate," she said. "It's barely the size of a closet." "It's adequate," she said again. She was not going to take a better room because he offered it. She was going to earn a better room the same way she was going to earn everything else here, by continuing to do the work until it was done and not receiving anything as a kindness that she could have as a right. He seemed to understand this, or at least not to argue with it. "Good night," she said. She went back to the kitchen, where Walt was washing the last of the dinner dishes in the slow, philosophical way of a teenager performing an unwanted task. And she sat at the table and opened the ledger to the section she hadn't finished yet, and she worked. Through the window she could see part of the yard, lantern light from the bunkhouse, the dark shape of the stable. The beginning of the hills that went up and became something she still didn't have language for. She had been here 7 days. She had found nearly $800 in losses, mapped a scheme that involved at least 3 people, and possibly the Cole Mercer gang, survived the judgment of 14 men, and established a working kitchen from what had been effectively a salvage operation. She was also exhausted in a way that was deeper than sleep, the kind of exhaustion that comes from doing all of this while simultaneously managing the knowledge that any one of those 14 men could decide on any given morning that she didn't belong here, and that Nate Callahan's protection, which she had not asked for and would not rely on, was the only formal claim she had on a position that had been offered without proper authority in the first place. Walt finished the dishes and said goodnight without ceremony, which she appreciated. She stayed at the table. She turned to the page in her notebook where she had written, on the first night, things that need to be true for this to work. It had been a list of 4 items. She had checked off 2 of them. She looked at the other 2 for a moment. Then she turned to a new page and kept working, because the numbers were still there, and the work was not finished, and finishing things was the only way she had ever found to make a place in a world that had not planned to make room for her. Outside, the ranch went quiet around her, settling into the specific night sounds of a place that did not stop just because the people in it needed rest. And Maggie Whitmore, who had come here with $4 and her father's faith in careful work, bent over her ledger in the lamplight and kept adding up the truth. Nate spoke to Dunmore on Saturday morning. Maggie did not witness the conversation. She was in the kitchen when it happened. She heard the office door close with a specific firmness that suggested the kind of privacy that is enforced rather than requested, and she heard, after some time, the lower register of 2 men's voices without any of the words. She kept her hands in the bread dough she was working and did not move toward the wall to listen because she was not that kind of person, and also because she had already done her part. The numbers were accurate. What happened next with them was not her jurisdiction. Walt came in from the yard while she was working and sat on the stool by the window without being asked. He was the kind of boy who moved toward occupied rooms when he was uneasy, the way animals move toward warmth. Dunmore's horse is saddled, he said. Out front. She kept working the dough. Is it? Yeah. A pause. You think he's leaving? I don't know, she said. He's been here forever, Walt said. Longer than me. Since before Nate bought the east pasture. She said nothing. Did he do something wrong? Walt said. She looked at him. He was 15, with an honest face and the direct questions of someone who had not yet learned that adults preferred their difficult truths wrapped in something softer. That's between him and Nate, she said. But you know, Walt said, what I know is in the ledger, she said, which is where it belongs. Walt was quiet for a while. Then, Hobart says you're trying to get Dunmore fired so you can take over. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. Hobart says that. Yeah. And what do you say? Walt considered this with the seriousness of someone taking the question literally. I say you've been up before 5 every morning fixing things that were broke before you got here, he said. So I don't know what Hobart's looking at. She did not tell him that this was one of the more useful things anyone had said to her in recent memory. She just said, get me more flour from the bin. And he did. Dunmore left Iron Ridge Ranch that afternoon. She did not see him go. She heard the horse and looked out the kitchen window and saw a figure on horseback moving down the ranch road at a pace that was not hurried and not slow, the particular pace of a man who has decided something and is now living in the aftermath of it. His saddlebags were full. He did not look back at the house. She watched until he was gone and then turned back to the stove. Nate came to the kitchen doorway an hour later. He looked like a man who had been awake for longer than the morning accounted for. The specific kind of tired that comes from having a hard conversation and then having to go on with the day regardless. He admitted it, he said. The invoices. Not the cattle, he swore on that, but the invoices. Said the Mercer brother approached him about 8 months ago. Said he thought he was just... He stopped, pressed his mouth together. Said he thought he could keep it small. They always do, she said. He looked at her. The ones who start small, she said. They always think small means manageable. It never does. He leaned against the doorframe. He looked out the window at the yard where several of the hands had noticed Dunmore's departure and were doing the specific kind of busy work that means you're waiting for information. I need a new foreman, he said. You do, she said. I don't have anyone ready for it. She thought about Purvis, who appeared wherever something needed doing without being asked, and Eddie, who had the mental quickness she associated with people who would grow into responsibility if given the frame for it. She thought about these things and said nothing, because it had been 8 days and she understood the difference between having an opinion and having earned the standing to voice it in this particular context. I'll manage the operational side myself for a while, Nate said. Longer hours. I can take some of the scheduling, she said. Supply orders, delivery tracking, worker time records. That's bookkeeping work. He looked at her. That's more than you were hired for, he said. I was hired for bookkeeping and cooking, she said. Scheduling is just bookkeeping with people instead of numbers. Something moved across his face. That almost expression she had noticed before. The near smile that his face attempted and then reconsidered. All right, he said. He pushed off the door frame and went back out to the yard, and she heard him speaking to the hands in a voice that was calm and matter-of-fact, saying Dunmore had moved on, no other explanation offered, and she thought that was probably the right approach. Not dramatizing it, not diminishing it, just naming the fact and moving forward. She turned back to the stove and thought about a man named Bill Mercer in Calverton, who was now missing his arrangement with the inside of Iron Ridge Ranch, and she thought about what that might mean for what happened next. October came in hard and cold. Wyoming autumn was not the genteel, slow-fading autumn of Boston, where the trees went orange in a polite sequence, and the cold arrived with a kind of apologetic incrementalism. Wyoming autumn arrived like a decision. 1 week the days were manageable. The next week the wind came off the high country with an edge that got inside your coat regardless of the coat, and the sky went that specific shade of gray that meant business. Maggie had bought a proper coat in Calverton on her second supply run. Heavy wool, men's cut because there were no women's coats in the mercantile that would have fit her, and she had long since stopped caring what a coat looked like as long as it did its job. Walt had come with her on the wagon and had the good sense not to comment on anything she purchased. She had also, on that same trip, stopped at the deputy sheriff's office and told Deputy Ira Foss what she knew about Breckenridge Dry Goods and Bill Mercer. Foss was a man in his late 40s who had the slightly distracted manner of someone running behind on too many things simultaneously. He listened to her with his elbows on his desk and his hat pushed back on his head, and when she finished he said, "You got this from the ranch books?" From the ranch books, the delivery logs, and a cross-reference against what Dunmore confirmed to Nate Callahan before he left, she said. Foss looked at her for a moment. "Callahan sent you?" "Callahan knows I'm here," she said. "I came because I saw the information, and I thought it was relevant to a gang that's been robbing stages for 3 weeks. Foss sat back. "Bill Mercer's been on our list," he said. "Hard to pin. He's careful." "He's been less careful on the ranch contracts," she said, and put the figures in front of him. He read through them slowly. She could see him working through the numbers and finding the same pattern she had found, which told her he was not as distracted as he appeared. "I'll need the original records," he said. "Copies," she said. "The originals stay at the ranch." He looked up. "I need something to take to a judge," he said, "and I need the originals in case this goes to a civil proceeding about the ranch's losses," she said. "These are accurate copies in my handwriting. I'll swear to their accuracy." He studied her for a moment. "What's your name again?" "Margaret Whitmore." "You the new bookkeeper out at Iron Ridge?" "Yes." He picked up the copies. "All right, Miss Whitmore. I'll be in touch with Callahan." She nodded and left. She did not tell Nate about the deputy visit until that evening, and when she told him she did it directly, what she had done and why, what Foss had said, what the likely next steps were. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "You should have told me first." "I should have," she said. "I decided the information was time-sensitive and I acted on it. That was my judgment call. You can tell me if you disagree with how I handled it." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't disagree with how you handled it," he said. "I just would have liked to know." "Next time I will," she said. He nodded, and that was it. No long discussion of her overreach, no reassertion of hierarchy. Just, "I would have liked to know." She filed that away as useful information about the kind of man she was working for. The new scheduling arrangement lasted approximately 2 weeks before it became obvious to everyone that it was not, technically, a temporary arrangement. She had taken over supply ordering in the first week, which required visiting or writing to 3 suppliers in Calverton and 2 in Cheyenne, and developing a tracking system for delivery expectations that she built into a separate ledger which she kept current daily. In the second week, she had taken on time records for the hands, who worked what shifts, overtime during the fence repair that Purvis had finally been authorized to do, hours for the 2 seasonal workers. Because Nate was managing the cattle work and the operational side and doing the time records himself at night and getting the math wrong out of exhaustion. She sat down at the table one evening while he was doing the records and watched him add a column wrong. "That's off by 4 hours," she said. He looked at the page, looked back. "Damn." "Give it to me," she said. He looked up. He had been ranching since 6 in the morning, and it was now past 9 at night, and there was mud on his jacket that he hadn't noticed. He gave her the records. She had them done in 30 minutes. After that, the time records were hers without either of them saying so formally. This was how most of the arrangement had evolved, not by discussion, but by accumulation, by the practical logic of who could do what efficiently while the other person was doing something else. Hobart noticed. Hobart had been noticing for 2 weeks, and his noticing had a specific shape. Not hostile exactly, more like a man watching a game change its rules and deciding whether to play or object. He had said something about Dunmore twice, in Maggie's hearing, in the tone of someone narrating a grievance rather than addressing one. She had not responded either time. On a Wednesday, 3 weeks into October, Hobart came into the kitchen while she was writing the weekly supply order and sat down across the table from her without being invited. She kept writing. "You're doing Dunmore's job," he said. "Some of it," she said. "And the cooking." "Yes." "And the books." "Also yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot for one person." "It is," she said. "So you're planning to stay?" She looked up. Was there a question in there somewhere? He rested his forearms on the table. He was not a stupid man. She had established that early. He was a man who organized himself around a strong sense of how things should work, and she represented a disruption to that sense that he had not yet classified. "Dunmore was here 11 years, he said. "I know," she said. "He made mistakes, but he knew this place." "He did," she said, "and he used that knowledge in ways that cost this ranch close to $800. Hobart's jaw worked. "That's," he started. "True," she said. "I'm not saying it to speak ill of him. I'm saying it because you're implying that length of tenure equals trustworthiness, and the record doesn't support that." He was quiet. She went back to the supply order. "Most of the men," Hobart said after a moment. "They think you're all right." She kept writing. "Most." "Yeah." "And you?" He was quiet for a long time. She finished 2 lines of the order before he spoke again. "I think you're capable," he said, which from Hobart was clearly the kind of compliment that cost something to give. "I think Nate's getting his money's worth." "But," she said. "But this is cattle country," he said, "and a woman running the—" He stopped, seeming to realize he didn't have clean language for what he was trying to say. "The administrative operation of a cattle ranch?" she said. "It's not how it's done." She set down her pen. She looked at him directly and she said, not unkindly, but without any softening, "Hobart, I've heard that my entire life about every room I've ever walked into. I stopped finding it a useful piece of information about 5 years ago. Either the work is good or it isn't. Either the ranch is better or it isn't. That's the only thing that applies here." He held her gaze. He had steady eyes, the kind that didn't flicker when they were challenged, which she actually respected. "All right," he said. Finally. "All right." He stood up. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table, and then, at the door, he turned back. "Biscuits are better than last week," he said. "I know," she said. He left. She went back to the order. The news about the Mercer gang arrived on a Tuesday in late October, delivered by Deputy Foss himself, who rode out from Calverton in the mid-morning and found Nate in the south pasture and Maggie in the supply room reorganizing the dry goods inventory. She heard the horse and came to the door of the supply room when Nate and Foss crossed the yard. Foss saw her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, with a nod that meant her information had proved useful, which she had already suspected, or he wouldn't be here in person. They went inside. Foss sat at the main room table and put his hat down and said, "Bill Mercer's been arrested. Cheyenne marshals picked him up yesterday morning. The invoices you brought me, combined with 2 other operations he'd been running with the gang, ranch supply schemes, same pattern, gave us enough for a judge. Nate said, "And Cole?" "Still at large," Foss said. "That's the problem. With Bill in custody, Cole's going to know we've been working the supply angle. He'll change his pattern. He may also," Foss paused, "he may also be looking to settle accounts with whoever gave up the scheme." The room went quiet. Maggie understood what Foss was not quite saying directly. "You think he'll come after the ranch," she said. Foss looked at her. "I think it's possible. He's lost his inside man, his brother's arrested, and he knows the information came from Iron Ridge's books. That's motive." "You have anyone watching the territory?" Nate said. "Deputy out of Laramie's working the roads, but I can't promise coverage on every ranch in the county." He looked at Nate. "I'd suggest extra precautions for a few weeks, until we get Cole." After Foss left, Nate stood in the main room for a moment. He turned to Maggie. "You should know," he said, "that this may have put you in the middle of something." "I put myself in the middle of something," she said, "when I walked into the deputy's office." "I know." He looked at the window, at the yard, at the hills beyond. "I'm going to go to Laramie, join the group hunting Cole. They need men who know this territory, and I've been riding it for 6 years. She looked at him. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, Dean." "How long?" "Don't know. A week, maybe 2. She thought about 8 ranch hands and a 15-year-old boy and a supply room she'd just reorganized and a set of books that were for the first time in at least 14 months actually accurate. "I'll manage the ranch," she said. He turned back from the window. "Maggie." "I've been managing the administrative side for 3 weeks," she said. "Purvis can handle the cattle work. Eddie can help him. I'll coordinate between them and manage everything else." "That's not—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "Not what a bookkeeper does? We established 3 weeks ago that my job description was flexible." He looked at her for a long moment. "Cole Mercer has 7 men," he said. "If he decides to come here, then I'll deal with that when it happens," she said. "If it happens." Deputy Foss said possible, not certain. "He said possible because he's careful with his words," Nate said. "I know Cole Mercer, not personally, but by reputation. He doesn't let debts go." "Then go catch him," she said. "That solves the problem at the source." He studied her face. "Stay safe," he said. Finally. "These men are dangerous." "I understand that," she said. "I met their employer on the road 3 weeks ago, remember?" He put a gun in my face. Something moved in Nate's expression at that, something that wasn't entirely professional concern. "I remember," he said. She turned back to her supply list, which was still sitting on the table. "I'll have Purvis brief me on the cattle rotation tonight," she said. "You should get your things ready." He was quiet for a moment, and then he went. He left at dawn with 2 other men from a neighboring ranch who had come by the evening before, a combined riding group that would meet the Laramie deputy on the Territory Road by noon. Maggie was up before he left. She handed him a wrapped parcel of food for the road, biscuits and salt pork, practical things. And he took it without comment and swung up onto his horse and looked down at her in the early gray light. "Don't let Hobart run the kitchen," he said. "I wasn't planning to," she said. He rode out. She watched the 3 horses until the road bent and took them behind the hill, and then she turned back to the yard and looked at Iron Ridge Ranch in the first light of morning. The outbuildings, the stable, the bunkhouse, with smoke just starting from its chimney, the wide sweep of pasture where the cattle were beginning to move. She thought about Cole Mercer somewhere in the territory, and she thought about what a man like that did when the arrangement that was feeding him got cut off. Then she called out for Purvis, who was already in the yard because Purvis was always already in the yard, and they spent an hour going over the cattle rotation and what needed doing in the next 2 weeks, and she wrote it all down in the practical way she had learned from her father, clearly, specifically, with contingencies noted. She was not comfortable. She did not pretend to herself that she was comfortable, but discomfort had never been the measure she used for whether to proceed. The first 4 days were manageable. Purvis ran the cattle work with the quiet authority of a man who had been doing it by instinct for years and simply needed someone to formalize the decisions he was already making. Eddie proved fast and reliable in the field. Even Hobart, who had settled into something closer to grudging cooperation over the past weeks, did his work without drama. She cooked, managed the books, coordinated with Purvis morning and evening, handled a supply delivery that arrived a day late and with 2 items substituted without notice. She sent a letter to the Calverton supplier about that, in language that was polite and precise and left no room for misunderstanding, and tracked a fence repair on the west property line that Purvis said couldn't wait. On the 5th day, a woman from Calverton came. She arrived in a 2-horse buggy on a Thursday afternoon, a woman in her mid-40s, well-dressed for the territory, with the particular bearing of someone who considered herself the social center of her community. She introduced herself as Clara Baines, wife of the man who owned Calverton's feed mill, and said she had come to call on Nate, having heard he was away, and would be happy to leave her card. Maggie understood the visit immediately. Clara Baines had not come to leave a card. She had come to see whether the rumors were true, that Nate Callahan had installed some large woman from Boston in his household, in a position of unclear authority with an unclear personal relationship, and was away from his ranch, leaving her in charge of everything. Maggie invited her in and gave her coffee. Clara accepted the coffee and looked around the main room with an expression that was politely appraising, which meant she missed nothing. "You're the new bookkeeper," Clara said. "Among other things," Maggie said. "Boston, I heard." "That's right." Clara looked at her hands, the ink on her fingers from the morning's accounts, and then at her dress, which was practical, and then at her face. "It must be quite an adjustment," Clara said. "The territory." "I found it straightforward," Maggie said. "The winters are very difficult," Clara said, "for women who aren't accustomed." "I'll manage," Maggie said. Clara smiled the smile of a woman who has decided on her conclusion and is looking for places to put it. "Nate is a very good man," she said. "Very well regarded. He'll need a proper match eventually, someone who understands the territory." Maggie drank her coffee. "I'm sure he will," she said. "There are several good families in Calverton," Clara said. "The Morrison girls are very accomplished. Sarah Morrison in particular is lovely," Maggie said. Clara paused. She had expected either defensiveness or deference, and she was getting neither, which left her temporarily without her next move. "Well," she said, "I'll leave my card for Nate." "I'll see that he gets it," Maggie said. Clara left. Maggie stood in the doorway and watched the buggy roll back down the ranch road and felt the specific fatigue that came from social performances, which took a different kind of energy than physical work and left a different kind of residue. Walt appeared from the direction of the stable. "Who was that?" he said. "A woman leaving a card," Maggie said. "She looked like she was measuring something," Walt said. "She was," Maggie said. "Come on, I need you to help me move the flour barrels." On the 6th day, Eddie came back from his morning ride to the east pasture line with a different quality to his pace that she noticed from the yard. She was there when he pulled up. "Tracks," he said, without preamble. "East side, along the creek bed. Multiple horses. Recent." She looked at him. "How many?" "Hard to say. 4 at least. Maybe more. Coming from the south, paralleling the ranch road, then turning off." She felt something shift in her chest. Not panic exactly, the thing before panic, the recognition of a shape of danger before the danger has fully arrived. "Tell Purvis," she said. "Get everyone in close. No one on the far pastures today." Eddie went. She went to the main house, to Nate's office, to the cabinet where, because she had taken inventory of everything in the first week, she knew there were 2 rifles and a shotgun and ammunition for all 3. She took the shotgun and the ammunition and brought them to the kitchen and put them under the table where she worked. Then she went back and took one of the rifles and brought it to the bunkhouse and told Hobart where the second one was. Hobart looked at the rifle and then at her. "You think they're coming?" he said. "I think being ready is cheaper than being surprised," she said. He took the rifle. She spent the afternoon managing the ranch from the kitchen. Purvis brought the cattle in from the east pasture, which took longer than planned and had its own complications with 2 animals that had been at the creek and didn't want to leave. Eddie and one of the seasonal men rode the perimeter at staggered intervals, which had been her idea and which gave her information about the property line that she updated on a rough map she'd drawn from Purvis's descriptions. By evening, everyone was in close. The horses were in the stable, the gates were secured. She cooked dinner and served it, and listened to the particular quality of a group of men eating in contained tension. Louder than usual, the kind of loud that is compensation, jokes that fell slightly flat. After dinner, she sat at the kitchen table with her map and the shotgun and went through what she knew. Cole Mercer had 7 men. She had 8 hands plus Walt plus herself. Mercer's men were armed and experienced at violence. Her men were armed and experienced at ranch work, which overlapped with violence in some ways and not others. She thought about the creek bed tracks and the direction they came from and what that said about where they might have been watching from. And she thought about the supply road and the main gate and the east fence line that Purvis had said was the weakest point. She got a fresh piece of paper and started writing. Not a list this time, a plan. She wrote it the way her father had taught her to approach any complex problem, in order of what she knew for certain, then what she could infer, then what she needed to account for even if she couldn't confirm it. She wrote the ranch layout as she understood it, the positions where she would put people if she were defending instead of working, the things she could do to make the ranch look less vulnerable from the outside than it was. She wrote until the fire in the stove burned low, and then she put more wood on it and kept writing. At some point, Walt came in for water and found her at the table with the map and the plan and the shotgun and stopped in the doorway. "You should sleep," he said. "Probably," she said. "You're going to be up all night anyway, aren't you?" he said. She looked at him. He was 15 and he was tired, and he had been following her lead all day with the careful attention of someone who has decided to trust a person and is now committed to that decision. "Go to bed, Walt," she said. "I'll wake you if anything changes." He went. She turned back to the paper. Outside, Wyoming was doing what it did at night in late October, cold and dark and enormous and entirely indifferent to the concerns of the small lives running across its surface. She could hear the cattle, distantly. She could hear the wind. She did not hear horses. Not yet. They came the following night. She had spent the day finishing the plan and walking it through with Purvis and Hobart and Eddie, which was its own kind of difficulty. Not because they resisted, but because presenting a defense plan meant believing an attack was coming, and believing that made it more real, and making it more real meant sitting with a fear she had been managing through the practical work of preparation. Purvis listened to everything she said and then went and did it. She had come to understand that about Purvis. He was not a man for discussion. He was a man for action. She had the plan. He executed it. They had developed, over the 6 days since Nate left, an efficient language between them that had no wasted words. Hobart, to his credit, was completely different from what she'd expected. The man who had pushed back on her first weeks at the ranch was the same man who now stood in the equipment barn entrance with a rifle and said, before he took his position, "You figure this right, we'll be fine." She had said, "I figure it right." He had nodded and gone. The attack began at roughly 2 in the morning. She knew it was beginning because the cattle in the east pasture reacted. A sudden collective unease that traveled through the herd like a wave, the way animals respond to something humans haven't sensed yet. She had positioned Walt at the north window of the main house with instructions to listen for exactly that. He came to the kitchen at a dead run. "East," he said. "Cattle are moving." She picked up the shotgun. "Get Purvis. East position, exactly like we talked about." He went. She went through the main house to the front door and opened it a careful inch and looked out into the dark yard. Nothing moving yet. The lanterns they had left burning were positioned where she'd asked, not at the house, but at the far end of the stable, drawing attention and light away from the main building. She heard the first shot from the east fence line, then shouting, then another shot. Then Cole Mercer's men came into the yard from 2 directions at once. 3 from the east gate that Purvis's team had left deliberately open as a channeling point, 2 more from the south side where Eddie and his man were waiting. It was not clean. It was not the organized engagement she had planned on paper. It was fast and loud and happened in patches of dark and lantern light, and she could not see all of it from the doorway, only parts of it. What she could see, Purvis's position held. What she could hear, Eddie's group driving the south entry men back. What she could tell, from the way the sounds were moving, they had expected an empty house and undefended stock, and they had found neither, and the discovery was costing them time and confidence. One man broke from the east group and ran for the main house. She opened the door and stood in it. He saw her, a large woman in the doorway with a shotgun, and she saw the half-second of pure confusion on his face, the recalibration that happens when the world is not what you planned for. "Stop," she said. He didn't stop. She fired above his head. Not at him, above him, and the sound in the enclosed yard was enormous, bouncing off every surface, and he stopped. On the ground, she said. He went down. Not because she had commanded it, but because Hobart appeared from behind the equipment barn with the rifle, and the man suddenly understood his arithmetic. She tied his hands herself with the rope she had put in the kitchen for exactly this purpose, which Walt had found mildly absurd when she'd put it there, and which Walt was now looking at with an expression of someone revising their assessments. The whole of it, the attack, the defense, the retreat, lasted less than 20 minutes. Cole Mercer pulled his remaining men back before the sky had changed color at all. 2 of his men were down, 1 taken, 1 injured, and going with him. None of her people were seriously hurt. Purvis had a gash on his arm from a fence post he'd run into in the dark, not from any of Mercer's men, and one of the seasonal workers had a bruise on his jaw from a fall. She stood in the yard afterward with the shotgun still in her hands, and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling and thought that this was what it felt like when a plan worked. Not triumphant, not the way it looked in stories, just the absence of the thing you'd been afraid of, just the specific quiet of danger that is past. Purvis came to stand beside her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He looked at the tied man sitting against the stable wall, looked at the yard, looked at the position she'd set up by the equipment barn. "You planned that right," he said. "We planned it right," she said. He shook his head slightly, not disagreeing, just something else. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just, when Nate gets back." He stopped. "He's going to have something to think about." She didn't respond to that. She looked out toward the east pasture where the cattle had settled again, and she thought about Cole Mercer riding somewhere in the dark of Wyoming with fewer men than he'd started with, and an awareness that Iron Ridge Ranch had not been what he'd expected. She thought about the specific satisfaction of being not what someone expected. Walt came up beside her. His face in the early dark was very young, and also not as young as it had been at the beginning of the evening. "Is it over?" he said. "For tonight," she said. "What about Mercer?" "That's for the deputy," she said. "And for Nate." She looked at Walt. "You did well." He straightened slightly, said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She turned back to the house. There was a prisoner to manage and a report to write for Foss, and a gash on Purvis's arm that needed cleaning and dressing, and in a few hours there would be breakfast for 14 and a supply order due in Calverton, and a fence on the east line that had been damaged in the night's business. She went back inside and put water on to boil and picked up her notebook and began writing down everything that had happened while it was still complete in her memory, because accurate records were the beginning of everything, and everything else could wait for the record to be right. Outside, the sky was beginning to go gray at its edges. The slow announcement of another Wyoming morning arriving without ceremony, without any particular interest in what had happened in the dark, just arriving the way it always did, requiring the people on its surface to meet it with whatever they had left. Maggie Whitmore had plenty left. Nate came back on a Thursday. She knew he was coming before she saw him because Purvis came in from the East Road at a trot and said simply, "Riders," and she had learned to read Purvis's economy of language well enough to know that one word meant something specific. Not danger, not strangers, but something expected. She was in the middle of the morning supply inventory when she came out to the yard. There were 4 of them, Nate and the 2 men who had ridden out with him and a 4th man she didn't recognize who was riding with his left arm bound against his chest in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with necessity. Nate was at the front. He had the particular set to his shoulders of someone who had been in the saddle for too many consecutive days and was not going to say so. He pulled up in the yard and looked at her, and then looked at the yard around her. The prisoner from the night of the attack had been turned over to Deputy Foss 2 days ago, but there were visible marks from that night still on the property. The damaged East Gate post, a section of fence near the stable that had been knocked down and propped back up but not yet properly reset. A long dark scorch mark on the ground near the equipment barn from a lantern that had been knocked over and stamped out before it became something worse. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at her again. "You were attacked," he said. "The night before last," she said. "Everyone's all right. We took one of Mercer's men prisoner. Foss has him. 2 others were injured. Mercer's men, not ours. Mercer pulled back before dawn." Nate was still looking at the scorch mark. And you managed this? He said. We managed it, she said. Purvis ran the east position. Hobart covered the equipment barn. Eddie and one of the seasonal men held the south entry. She paused. I coordinated. The man with his arm bound, she would learn later his name was Garrett, a rancher from the territory north of Calverton who had joined the hunting group, was watching this exchange from his horse with undisguised interest. Nate swung down. He stood in front of her for a moment, and she could see the weight of the past 10 days on him. Not just the riding, but whatever had happened out on the territory roads, the business of hunting dangerous men through country that didn't cooperate, the particular toll of that kind of sustained vigilance. Cole? She said. In custody, he said. Laramie Marshals got him. They got him 2 days ago. He paused. He had 5 men left by then. 2 had already come here. Yes, she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Come inside, he said. I need to hear all of it. But she told him at the kitchen table while Walt made coffee and Purvis came and went from the doorway with updates about the horses, which needed attending to after the long ride. She told it in order, the way she told everything. The tracks Eddie had found on the east side, the decision to bring everyone in close, the defensive position she had laid out with Purvis and Hobart, the night of the attack, the prisoner, the report she had sent to Foss. She put her written account on the table in front of him, 3 pages, dated and detailed, the same way she would have documented anything else. He read it while she talked, following along, and she noticed he went back to the second page twice, which meant there was something on it he was processing rather than just reading. When she finished, he sat with the papers for a moment. You set a trap, he said. I set a defensive position, she said. The east gate was a channeling point. If they came in there, they came in where we were ready. That's not a trap exactly. What would you call it? Applied logic, she said. He looked at the papers again. You could have sent everyone to Calverton, he said. Taken the hands, locked the house, left. That would have meant leaving the cattle, she said. And it would have meant Mercer got to burn the place without consequence, which would have made him more dangerous to every ranch in the territory, not just this one. He looked at her. That's why you stayed, he said, for the cattle and the territory. Those were the practical reasons, she said. He waited. She picked up her coffee. I also didn't want to leave, she said. I'm here. This is where I am. She said it plainly, without drama, because it was a plain truth. I wasn't going to run from it. Something shifted in Nate's expression. It was not the near smile she had seen before. It was something quieter and more complete than that, something that had to do with recognition rather than amusement. Walt put coffee in front of him and retreated to the far end of the kitchen with the excellent instincts of a 15-year-old who understood the room. Nate picked up the coffee and said, Purvis tell you what he thought of the plan? Not in words, she said. Purvis doesn't use many. No, Nate said. He doesn't. A pause. He told me last spring when I asked him about the previous bookkeeper, a man named Croft who lasted 3 months, that Croft had good numbers but no sense of the land, that you couldn't run a ranch with numbers alone. Another pause. He came and found me when we were 2 hours out this morning, rode ahead of the group, said he needed to tell me something before we got back. She waited. He told me, Nate said, that you had the best sense of the land of anyone he'd worked with since the man who taught him ranching in Texas in 1862. She was very still for a moment. Purvis is from Texas? She said. Something happened in Nate's face. Then that was not the near smile, and was not the quiet recognition, and was not anything she had seen before, but it was a real laugh, brief and unguarded. The kind that arrives before a person has decided to allow it. It changed the whole quality of the room. That's what you took from that, he said. It was the most surprising part, she said. He shook his head, still with that expression. Maggie, he said, and stopped. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. For staying, for all of it. She held his gaze and said, This is a good place, worth staying for. He nodded once, and the conversation moved on to practical things. The gate, the fence, what Foss would need for the legal proceedings against Cole Mercer, whether the injured man, Garrett, would stay at the ranch while his arm healed or make for home. They talked for another hour, and outside the kitchen window, Wyoming was bright and cold and enormous, And inside the kitchen was warm and specific and small, and she thought that was the right way around for things to be. The weeks that followed. Cole Mercer's arrest reorganized Iron Ridge Ranch in ways both visible and invisible. The visible ones were practical. The east gate was repaired properly, which Purvis oversaw with characteristic thoroughness. The damaged fence section was reset. The supply arrangement with Breckenridge Dry Goods, dead now that Bill Mercer was in Laramie facing charges, was replaced with a direct contract with a supplier in Cheyenne that Maggie negotiated herself by letter over 2 weeks, getting a rate 4% lower than what Iron Ridge had been paying before Dunmore's arrangements had inflated things. She put the 4% figure in front of Nate with a note saying annualized savings, assuming current volume. He looked at it and said, "You negotiated this by letter." "Over 7 letters," she said. "They came down in increments. I waited them out." "How did you know they'd come down?" "Because their first offer was too high, and their second was too close to the first," she said. "When a supplier's second offer is within 5% of the first, they have room. If they were at their floor, they'd have held or walked away." He looked at the contract. "You enjoy this," he said. She thought about it honestly. "I enjoy it when it works," she said. "I find it interesting when it doesn't." He signed the contract. The invisible reorganizations were harder to measure. They happened in the way the ranch hands moved around her now. Not the careful negotiation of the first weeks, the constant low-level assessment of whether she belonged, but something easier and more habitual. She had become part of the operational geography of Iron Ridge the way a building becomes part of a landscape, not by announcing itself but by being consistently there. Hobart, remarkably, had become something approaching an ally. Not an effusive one. Hobart did not do effusive, but the reliable kind, the kind who said things to her directly that he might previously have said around her or not said at all. He stopped by the kitchen one morning in November and put a list on her table without preamble. 6 things on the ranch he thought needed attention before winter set in hard. She looked at it. "The water line to the north barn," she said. "That's not on here." He looked at his list. "I didn't think—" "The ground's already starting to freeze at night," she said. 3 weeks ago we had 4 days above freezing in a row. We won't have that again. The north barn line will freeze if it's not insulated before December." Hobart was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "Add it to the list," she said. He took the list back and added it and left, and she thought about the specific satisfaction of being taken seriously by someone who had started by not taking her seriously at all. It was not triumphant, it was just correct. Things being correct gave her a satisfaction that she didn't always have a clean way to articulate. Eddie knocked on the kitchen doorframe that same afternoon with a question about the cattle rotation records. He had been helping Purvis with the operational side since Dunmore left, and had developed, without anyone formally deciding this, a kind of working partnership with her on the scheduling side of things. He was quick, and he didn't need things explained twice, which she valued more than she would have predicted. "These numbers from October," he said, putting a page in front of her. "The east pasture count doesn't match what Purvis had in the field log." She looked at it. 6 head difference, she said. "Right. Do you know where—" "They were moved to the south pasture on October 14th when we brought everything in close before the attack," she said. "I noted it in the operational log, but it didn't get transferred to the cattle record." She picked up the cattle record and made the notation. "Cross-reference note here. If you're reconciling the two, that's the gap." Eddie watched her make the notation. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you keep track of all of it?" he said. "The books, the supply contracts, the cattle count, the scheduling. It's all in your head." "It's not in my head," she said. "It's in the notebooks." "That's the point. I don't trust my head. My head makes errors. The notebooks don't, if you fill them correctly." He looked at the notebooks stacked at the end of the table. "Dunmore never kept notebooks," he said. "He kept everything up here." He tapped his temple. "Said a good foreman didn't need paper." "Dunmore stole $780 from this ranch," she said. Eddie was quiet. "The paper," she said, "is how you know." He nodded, slowly, the way someone nods when a thing clicks into place. "I'd like to learn it," he said. "The record-keeping, properly." She looked at him. He was 24, quick-minded, reliable in the field. He had the instincts of someone who would grow into significant responsibility if someone gave him the framework for it. "Come by after supper on Thursday," she said. "Bring a notebook. He came on Thursday, and then the following Thursday, and the one after that, which was how it became a regular thing that nobody formally decided on, and that Eddie threw himself into with the specific hunger of someone who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for exactly this. November settled in around Iron Ridge Ranch with the particular completeness of a Wyoming winter, making its intentions known. The days shortened until the light came late and went early, and the hours between felt compressed and purposeful. The cold was serious, the kind that was not dramatic but was constant, and that required the ranch to function like a living thing that kept its own heat. Maggie had adapted to it practically, which was the only way she knew to adapt to anything. She wore the heavy coat. She kept the kitchen warm because the kitchen was also the warmest room in the main house, and warmth was a practical necessity in addition to anything else. She learned where the drafts came from and which doors needed the gap sealed and where the water lines needed watching. She had moved to the room at the end of the east wing in mid-October, not because Nate had offered it again, but because she had looked at the first snowfall coming in under the door of the room off the kitchen and made a practical decision. She had told Nate she was moving at dinner that evening, not asked, and he had said only, "Walt cleared the chimney in there last week. Should draw well." The room was 3 times the size of the previous one. It had a window that looked east over the pastures and a small writing desk that she moved to face the window. And in the early mornings, she sat at that desk with her coffee and her notebooks and watched Wyoming come light and thought about the kind of life that had assembled itself around her in the past 2 months without her fully realizing it was assembling. She thought about this with the care she gave to anything that required accurate accounting. She had come here with a job description and a 30-day trial and $4. She was now running the administrative operation of a working cattle ranch, managing a supply chain that served 14 people and several hundred head of cattle, training a young man in operational bookkeeping, and had recently defended the property against an armed attack with approximately the same methodical thoroughness she brought to reconciling a ledger. She thought, "This was not what I planned." She thought, "I do not know what I planned." She thought, "My father would have found this entirely logical." The conversation happened on a Sunday in late November. Sundays at Iron Ridge had a different rhythm than the rest of the week. Not because anyone stopped working, but because the intensity changed. A collective acknowledgement that even in cattle country, the pace could shift for one day without catastrophe. The hands had a longer breakfast, and the morning work started later, and there was a general sense of things being allowed to breathe. Nate had been in Calverton the day before for the legal proceedings regarding Cole Mercer, a preliminary hearing before a territorial judge that was the first formal step in what was going to be a lengthy process. He had come back Saturday evening with the controlled expression of a man who had been in a room full of lawyers and emerged still standing. On Sunday morning, he came into the kitchen while she was writing in her notebook, the weekly summary she kept, which tracked everything from supply costs to labor hours to a running estimate of cattle health based on what Purvis reported. And he poured his own coffee, which he had never done in the beginning but had begun doing in the past few weeks, and sat across from her at the table. She kept writing. They had become comfortable with shared silence, which was something she valued more than she could explain. The ability to be in a room with a person without the room requiring constant management. After a while, he said, "The judge asked about the documentation." She looked up. "For the Mercer case," he said. "The invoices, the supply records, the ledger entries. Foss had your copies. The judge wanted to know who had put the evidence together." She waited. "Foss told him," Nate said. The judge said, and this is close to his exact words, that it was some of the clearest financial documentation he'd seen presented in a territorial case. She said nothing. "He asked if you'd be willing to testify," Nate said. "When it comes to that. Probably spring." "I'll testify," she said. "You don't have to decide now." "I already decided," she said. "I'll testify." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not worried about—" "About what?" she said. "About being a large woman from Boston who doesn't look like anyone's idea of a reliable witness?" She picked up her coffee. "Let them underestimate me. It's been working out fine so far." He was quiet, and then, "I want to talk to you about the foreman position." She set down the coffee. "I know," she said. "You know?" "I've been waiting for you to raise it," she said. "I didn't want to assume." He looked at her steadily. "You've been doing it," he said, "functionally, for 2 months. The scheduling, the supply chain, the coordination with Purvis, the whole operational picture. I haven't had to think about half of what I used to spend every day thinking about because you've already thought about it. I know, she said again. I'm asking if you want it formally, he said. Foreman, right? Or whatever title you want. The same authority Dunmore had, but with the administrative side you're already running built in. A proper wage for all of it. She thought about this. Not because she was uncertain. She was not uncertain. She was thinking about what her father would say, which was, read the whole document before you sign. Not because the terms were wrong, but because understanding everything before you committed to it was simply the correct way to do things. What's the proper wage? She said. He named a figure. It was more than she had expected, and she kept her face neutral the way she had learned to keep her face neutral when numbers landed in a negotiation. Then she said, that accounts for the cooking too? Yes. I'd like to train Walt as a kitchen assistant, she said, formally, so the cooking doesn't become a single point of failure if I'm needed elsewhere. He blinked. You're negotiating. I'm establishing terms, she said. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved. Walt as kitchen assistant, he said. Done. And Eddie continues on the bookkeeping training, she said. That's not a negotiation point. That was already happening. I'm just making it official. Done, he said. Anything else? She thought. The North Barn water line needs insulating before December, she said. Hobart already has it on his list, but I want to make sure it's resourced properly. It'll need a full day and 2 men. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was becoming more capable of reading. Still, not simple, never quite simple with him, but this one had something in it that was close to helpless, and also not displeased about that. Maggie, he said, I'm offering you a formal position, not submitting a maintenance request. The water line is a legitimate operational concern, she said. I know it is, he said. I'll authorize the resources. Will you take the position? She looked out the east window. The pastures were gray and frost-covered under a white sky, the cattle moving in their slow, purposeful way along the fence line that had been repaired after the attack. She could see 2 of the hands on horseback, too far to identify, but the way they rode said it was Eddie and one of the seasonal men, doing the morning check. She thought about Boston, where she had spent years trying to make herself smaller to fit into spaces that did not want her. She thought about the stage road where Cole Mercer had laughed at her, and she had stood in the dust with her journal and not broken. She thought about 30 days. Yes, she said. I'll take the position. He put his hand out across the table. She looked at it for a moment, then shook it. His hand was a working man's hand, rough and strong and genuinely used, and the handshake was direct and complete and lasted exactly as long as a handshake between equals should last, not longer. Good, he said. Good, she said. She went back to her notebook. After a moment, he went back to his coffee. The kitchen was warm and the morning was quiet, and outside Wyoming did not care about any of it, which was, she had found, one of the things she appreciated most about Wyoming. News traveled in the territory, the way water traveled across flat land, wide and fast and finding its own path without much assistance. By the end of that week, the substance of what had happened at Iron Ridge had circulated through Calverton and beyond, the attack, the defense, the prisoner, the legal proceedings, and now, the formal appointment of Margaret Whitmore as foreman of Iron Ridge Ranch. The reactions were varied. Deputy Foss came by personally to confirm her availability for the spring testimony and stayed for coffee and said, without any of the tentativeness of his first encounter with her, that documentation package will hold up. I've shown it to 2 other deputies working similar gang cases. They want to know who taught you that method. My father, she said. He must have been good, Foss said. He was, she said. Clara Baines sent a note, which Maggie read with genuine appreciation for its layers. On the surface, it congratulated Nate on the successful resolution of the gang situation. Beneath the surface, it was asking specific questions about the nature of Maggie's role and presence at the ranch in language that was so careful it communicated exactly what it was trying not to communicate. She set the note on Nate's desk without comment and let him deal with it, which she suspected took him considerably less than 5 minutes. The hands at Iron Ridge, for their part, had already incorporated the change in Maggie's title without requiring the title to do much work. Purvis had been operating in partnership with her for 2 months. Eddie's Thursday evening sessions were now an established feature of the week. Hobart had his list, and she had her notebooks, and they operated in a parallel that had become efficient. Walt had been told he was now officially a kitchen assistant, which he received with the particular dignity of a 15-year-old who is trying not to show that being officially something matters to him. The reaction that surprised her most came from the two seasonal workers. Their names were Cord and Avery, and she had interacted with them primarily through scheduling, their hours, their assignments, their pay calculations. They were men in their 30s who moved through life with the self-contained quality of people who expected to be temporary everywhere and had adjusted their attachments accordingly. On the Friday of that week, Cord stopped her in the yard. "Heard you're staying on," he said. "Formally," she said. "I was already staying on." He nodded. He had his hat in his hands, which she had noticed men did when they were about to say something they'd considered. "We work a lot of ranches," he said. "Me and Avery, through the territory. Winter work, spring work, wherever's hiring." He turned the hat. "Most places, if something goes wrong, the rancher goes somewhere while the hands sort it out or don't." She waited. "You didn't go somewhere," he said, "when Mercer's men came." "No," she said. "You stayed and you planned it out and it worked," he said. "I just wanted to say, that's not nothing." He put his hat back on and went back to his work, and she stood in the cold yard for a moment thinking about the particular weight of being seen by someone who had no stake in seeing you, no reason to say anything, who said it anyway because it was true. She went back to her supply records. December arrived. The North Barn water line was insulated by the first week, which proved its necessity when the temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night on the 7th of the month, and 3 other ranches in the county had line problems that cost them 2 to 3 days of disrupted animal care. Iron Ridge did not have line problems. Hobart said nothing about this. He didn't need to. She had established by now a working rhythm to her days that felt like something she had built with her own hands, which she had, in the sense that she had constructed it piece by piece from nothing that had existed before she arrived. The morning accounting took the first 2 hours while breakfast was managed. The middle of the day was operational, coordination with Purvis, the scheduling board she had mounted in the equipment barn that told every man on the ranch what was expected of them on any given day, the supply tracking that happened as deliveries came and went. Evenings were for the more complex bookkeeping, the correspondence, the forward planning. She was tired in a way that was satisfying rather than depleting, which she had learned to recognize as the signature of work that was correctly sized to a person's capacity. Not too small to be boring, not too large to be destructive, but the right fit, the work you were built for. She thought about this one evening at her desk, watching the last light go off the eastern pastures, the cattle reduced to dark shapes against white ground. She thought about it the way you think about a thing when you're trying to understand it before it changes, because she had learned, this was her father's lesson, the deepest one, that things always changed, and the only way to appreciate what you had was to be clear-eyed about it while you had it. She had come here as a cook and bookkeeper. She was now the foreman of Iron Ridge Ranch. She had been mocked in the yard on her first day, and she had exposed a financial scheme that had cost the ranch nearly $800, and she had defended the property against an armed attack with a plan that had worked because she had thought it through correctly, and she had negotiated a supply contract that saved 4% annually, and she had begun training a 24-year-old to manage books and a 15-year-old to manage a kitchen, and she had built, without planning to build it, something that felt like belonging. Not because Nate had offered it to her, not because the hands had decided to accept her, but because she had done the work, consistently, and the work had built the place, and the place had become hers in the way that things become yours when you put enough of yourself into them. She was aware that this was not a complete accounting. She was aware that there was something else happening at Iron Ridge Ranch that she had been keeping in her peripheral vision because she did not know yet what to do with it, and she was a woman who did not move toward things she hadn't thought through completely. She thought about Sunday morning in November and Nate's handshake, which had been exactly the handshake of equals. She thought about the near smile that had become a real laugh, brief and unguarded, and how that single moment had changed the quality of the room in a way she still thought about more than was probably efficient. She thought about what her father would say about that. Her father would say, "Maggie, you're doing that thing where you add up all the columns except the one that matters." She closed her notebook. She looked at the dark eastern pasture. She thought, "I am aware of that column." She thought, "I will get there when I get there." She opened the notebook again and went back to the December supply projection, which was accurate and complete and asked nothing of her except careful attention, which she could always provide. Outside, the ranch was settling into its winter night. The sounds compressing in the cold, voices and animals, and the creak of buildings holding heat. And somewhere between the equipment barn and the main house, the lantern Nate always carried when he did the last evening check moved in a slow arc across the yard and then went still, and then went inside. She watched it go. She turned back to her numbers. The column she had been avoiding added itself up on a Tuesday in January. It was not a dramatic Tuesday. It was the kind of Tuesday that Wyoming produced in January without apology, cold past the point of being interesting, the sky the flat white of a sheet of paper with nothing written on it yet, the ground frozen hard enough that the sound of boots on it changed register. The cattle were close in, the hands were doing the indoor work that winter required. The ranch had the compressed inward quality of a living thing conserving itself against the season. She was at her desk when Nate knocked on the open door of the office. Her office now, the one that had been Dunmore's, which she had reorganized entirely in the first week after taking the position, because the previous filing system had been organized on principles she could not reverse engineer and had stopped trying to. And he said, "Ride with me." She looked up from the ledger. "It's 12 degrees. "I know what it is," he said. "Ride with me." She looked at him for a moment. He had the expression of a man who has decided something and is now in the part of the process that requires another person's participation. She closed the ledger. They rode east, which was the direction of the long pasture and the creek, and the place where the land rose in a gradual slope before falling away into the wider valley. She had ridden this ground enough times now, in all seasons except deep winter, to know its character the way you know the character of a person. Not just the surface, but the ways it behaved under pressure. He didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. She didn't press him. She had learned that Nate Callahan's silences were not the silences of a man who had nothing to say. They were the silences of a man organizing what he had to say into the right order, and interrupting that process produced worse results than waiting. When he spoke, he said, "My wife died 4 years ago." She had not known this. She had known there was something in his past that had left its marks on him, the way certain experiences leave their marks. Not visible exactly, but present in the way a person moved through the world, cautious about specific things in specific ways. She had not asked. It had not been her information to ask for. "Her name was Caroline," he said. "She came out here with me when we were both young and didn't know what we were getting into. She was good at this life. Better than me, some ways." A pause. "She died in the spring of '77. Fever that came fast and went faster. 3 days." He was looking at the horizon. "After that, I ran this place like I was running from something, which I probably was." She rode beside him and said nothing and listened. I've been very careful," he said, "about not letting anyone too close to this place. To the actual center of it, Dunmore was the closest thing, and that—" He stopped. "That had its own ending." "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her directly, which required him to turn in the saddle. She met his eyes. "You are at the actual center of this place," he said. "That happened without me planning it, and I've been trying to figure out what to do about it since approximately October." She said, "It's been a similar situation from my side." He held her gaze. "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "I've been ignoring a column in my accounting because I didn't know how to approach it. My father would have found that embarrassing." Something moved through Nate's expression then, that fullness she had been seeing more of recently. Not the near smile or the brief unguarded laugh, but something underneath both of those, the thing they had both been cover for. "I'm not a simple man," he said. "I want to say that first. Caroline is still real to me. That doesn't go away. And this place is hard, and there are years that are harder than others, and I don't always handle difficulty well." "I know that," she said. "I've been here 4 months." "You've seen the operational version of me," he said. "I've seen you after Dunmore left," she said, "and after you found out about the Mercers, and after you came back from 10 days hunting dangerous men, and when you had to sit across from lawyers." She paused. "You handle difficulty better than you think. You just don't handle it perfectly. Neither do I." He was quiet. "I'm also not simple," she said. "I'll say that in return. I've spent my whole life in rooms where I was the wrong size or the wrong shape or the wrong amount of everything. That leaves marks. I know it leaves marks because I catch myself waiting, still, for people to change their minds about me, for the ground to shift. I don't think I'll entirely stop waiting for that. I'm telling you because you should know. The horses moved beneath them, slow and steady in the cold. I know, he said. I've watched you wait for it. Every time you did something well and looked up to see how people were taking it. She had not known he'd seen that. I'm asking you, he said, to stop waiting, as far as I'm concerned, to understand that this ground is not going to shift. She looked at the frozen pasture. She looked at the hills beyond it, which were the color of old pewter under the white sky. She thought about Boston with a clarity she had not had when she left it, the clarity of distance and time. She thought about a woman who had been told for 28 years what she was and was not, and who had come to Wyoming with $4 in her father's notebook and found out the telling had been wrong. All right, she said. He reached across the space between the horses and put his hand over hers where it rested on the saddle. Not dramatically, just directly, the way he did everything. She turned her hand over and held his. They rode back to the ranch in the January cold, and when they got to the yard, the horses exhaled great white clouds of breath that hung in the air briefly, and then were gone. And she swung down, and so did he. And they were standing in the yard in the ordinary mid-morning of a Tuesday, with everything looking exactly the way it had looked 2 hours ago, and everything also being different. Walt came out of the stable and saw their faces and said nothing at all, which was the most sophisticated social instinct she had yet seen from him. She went back to her office and sat at her desk and opened the ledger to where she had left off and began working. She was smiling, which was not something she generally did while doing bookkeeping. She recognized it as an inefficiency and continued to smile anyway. The trial of Cole Mercer convened in Laramie in the 3rd week of March. Maggie testified on the 2nd day. She had spent 3 evenings preparing with the territorial prosecutor, a precise man named Aldous Webb, who had initially looked at her the way the Laramie courtroom would look at her, recalibrating, assessing, deciding, and who by the end of their first session was treating her with the focused respect of someone who has found an unexpectedly strong tool. The courtroom was not large. It had the specific character of provisional institutions in young territories, functional rather than imposing, wood benches, and a judge's bench that suggested authority rather than emanating it. It was full. These proceedings had attracted the territory's attention in the way that things do when they represent a reckoning. Cole Mercer sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer and looked exactly as she remembered him, contained, watchful, the man who performed danger rather than being careless about it. When she took the stand, his eyes found her immediately. She looked back at him. She was not going to look away from Cole Mercer in a courtroom in Laramie any more than she had looked away from him on a Wyoming road in September. Webb walked her through the documentation, the ledger entries, the receipt comparison, the cross-reference between delivery logs and invoice records. She explained each piece in the plain, specific language she would have used to explain a discrepancy to a ranch owner, which was the only language she knew for numbers. Mercer's lawyer attempted to complicate things on cross-examination. He suggested the irregularities might represent innocent bookkeeping errors by ranch staff. He suggested her interpretation of the records was one of several possible interpretations. He suggested, with the particular delicacy of a man who was about to say something he didn't want to say directly, that perhaps a woman without formal accounting credentials was not the appropriate interpreter of complex financial records. She let him finish. Then she said, "The ledger entries in question are in Randall Dunmore's handwriting, which I can demonstrate by comparison to signed documents from his tenure. The missing delivery records correlate precisely with the dates of 8 recorded payments to Breckenridge Dry Goods. The probability of 8 coincidental bookkeeping errors, each in the same direction, each benefiting the same external supplier with documented connections to the defendant, is not a probability any reasonable accountant would characterize as innocent. As for my credentials, I have been managing the accounts of Iron Ridge Ranch since September and recovered $780 in losses that accrued over the previous 14 months. I think that speaks to my competency adequately." The courtroom was very quiet. The judge, who had been making notes, looked up. He was the same judge who had told Foss the documentation was some of the clearest he'd seen in a territorial case. He looked at Mercer's lawyer with an expression that completed the thought the lawyer had not finished. The lawyer had no further questions. Cole Mercer was convicted on 7 counts. His sentencing would come the following month, but the range, Webb told her afterward in the courthouse corridor, was between 15 years and permanent. "You did that," Webb said. "The records did that," she said. "I just read them correctly." He almost smiled. "Miss Whitmore, or I suppose given your position, I should say, Maggie," she said, "is fine." Nate was waiting outside the courthouse. He had been in the territory all week, having come for the trial as the ranch owner whose property and finances were the foundation of the case. He stood in the March light that was finally beginning to carry some warmth in it at the top of the courthouse steps, and she walked out and stood beside him. "Convicted," she said. He exhaled. "All counts?" "All 7. He looked at the street below them. Laramie in late March, the mud season beginning, horses and wagons and people moving through the specific business of a town that was larger than Calverton, and still not large enough to have forgotten what frontier meant. "Bill Mercer's already confirmed 2 other supply operations," she said. "Different ranches, same pattern. Foss told me yesterday. Those proceedings will use our documentation as a template." "You built a template," Nate said. "My father built the method," she said. "I applied it." He looked at her. He had the expression she knew best by now, the full one, the one underneath all the others. "He would have been proud of you," he said. She stood with that for a moment. "Yes?" she said. "I think he would have been." They walked down the steps together into the March mud of Laramie, and she thought about her father sitting at a kitchen table in Boston, teaching a 12-year-old girl double-entry bookkeeping, not because it was what girls were supposed to learn, but because he believed that understanding how things actually worked was the most important thing a person could have, and that understanding belonged to anyone patient enough to acquire it. She had acquired it. She had carried it across the country in a journal pressed to her ribs, on a road where a man laughed at her and expected her to be nothing. She had used it to save a ranch and build a case, and establish a truth in a courtroom that would hold. Her father, she thought, had known exactly what he was doing. But spring came to Iron Ridge Ranch. The way it always came to that part of Wyoming, not gradually, but in lurches, 2 warm days followed by a cold snap, then a week of mud that made every task twice as hard. Then suddenly one morning the air had changed temperature and the cattle knew it before any person did, and began moving differently, with the energy of animals remembering what it felt like to have room. She was in the pasture on one of those first real spring mornings, on horseback, doing the count with Purvis, which had become a regular thing she did herself because there was no better way to understand the actual condition of the cattle than to ride among them. When she thought about the morning she had arrived in Wyoming, the stagecoach, the robbery, the 40 minutes on the road in shoes not made for this ground, the specific quality of Cole Mercer's laugh. She thought about it the way you think about old weather, with the knowledge that you survived it, and the acknowledgement that surviving it had cost something real. She had not arrived in Wyoming without fear. She had arrived with enormous fear, covered in the determined practicality that was the only tool she had for managing fear. She had been afraid in the kitchen on the first morning, and afraid in Nate's office with the ledger, and afraid in the dark the night Mercer's men came into the yard. Fear, she had found, was not the obstacle. Fear was the weather. You moved through it, or you didn't move. She had moved. Purvis brought his horse alongside hers at the eastern edge of the pasture, where the creek ran with the snowmelt that was the signature of this particular Wyoming April. "Count's good," he said. "Better than last spring," she said. It was. The records were clean now, the count accurate, the lost head from the previous year's manipulation fully accounted for in the current inventory. Iron Ridge Ranch's books were, for the first time in at least 2 years, a true picture of the operation. "Better than the spring before, too," Purvis said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the cattle. "You know what Cord said before he left for the next place?" "What did Cord say?" "Said this was the best run ranch he'd worked in 10 years. Purvis's voice did not carry emphasis. He was not a man for emphasis, but she had learned his registers and she knew this one was sincere. "Cord's particular," he added. "He doesn't say that." "Thank you, Purvis," she said. He nodded and turned his horse back toward the ranch, and she sat for a moment longer at the creek, with the water running over the rocks and the cattle grazing and the hills going up into the sky that was, today, genuinely blue for the first time since October. She thought about worth. Not the abstract concept, the specific practice of it, the daily question of how a person established their value in a world that began by assigning it based on the wrong criteria. She had watched it happen to herself. She had watched the men at the breakfast table assign her a number on the first morning based on what they saw, and then slowly, over weeks and months, revise that number upward as the evidence accumulated that they had started in the wrong place. She had felt the revision happening. She had watched Hobart move from hostility to grudging acknowledgement to something that was now, functionally, respect. She had watched Eddie go from a young man doing his job to a young man learning to understand what his job was part of, and she had been the teacher, and that meant something she didn't have clean language for. She thought, the world assigns your worth before it knows you. She thought, the work of your life is reassigning it. Not for them, for yourself. Because the hardest part was never convincing other people. The hardest part was the morning you woke up in the room off the kitchen, $4 and a dead father and a job that might not exist, and decided to do the work anyway. Not because the outcome was guaranteed, not because anyone was watching, but because the work was real, and you were real, and putting real effort into real things was the only way you had ever found to be solidly in your own life rather than hovering at its edge. She had spent 28 years hovering at the edge of her own life. She was done hovering. Nate asked her to marry him on a Saturday evening in April, which was not a day she would have predicted, but which, in retrospect, made complete sense. They had been in the main room after supper. She had taken to sitting there in the evenings sometimes instead of the office, which she had initially done because it was warmer and subsequently continued because it was where he was. He was reading. She was writing the monthly summary. The fire was doing what fires do in April when you still need them, but they feel like a concession rather than a necessity. He set down his book. She did not look up. Maggie, he said. She looked up. He was not nervous exactly. He was the particular version of still that a deliberate man becomes when he is about to say something he has thought about carefully and is now committed to. I want to ask you something, he said. All right, she said. I want you to be clear, he said, that I'm not asking because of the ranch. I'm not asking because of what you've built here or what you do here. Those things matter, and they're real, and I'd be lying if I said they weren't part of knowing who you are. But they're not why. She held her notebook in her lap and looked at him. I'm asking, he said, because I know who you are, not the foreman version, not the bookkeeper version, the version that walks 40 minutes in the wrong shoes rather than wait for someone to rescue her, the version that sends the deputy the right information even when it would have been easier not to, the version that sat in a dark kitchen on her first night in a strange place and kept working because that's just what she did. He paused. I know who you are, and I want to be in the same life as that person, for the rest of my life. The fire shifted. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the column she had been avoiding and how she had finally looked at it directly on a Tuesday in January on a frozen pasture, and how she had told him then that the ground shifting was the thing she was afraid of, and how he had said, his hands over hers in the cold, that the ground was not going to shift. It had not shifted. 4 months. Through the rest of winter and the beginning of spring, through the Laramie trial and the mud season and the first count of a healthy, accurately documented herd. He had been what she had assessed him to be. Not easy, not perfect, still carrying the weight of Caroline in the specific ways that loss persists in a person, still prone to the controlled silence that sometimes needed to be waited out. She had not found him simple. She had found him genuine, which was better than simple. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. She realized he had been holding it. You weren't certain I'd say yes, she said. I was maybe 80% certain, he said. That's not a comfortable margin, she said. No, he said. It was an uncomfortable 3 weeks. She set down the notebook and stood up and crossed the room and sat beside him, which required sharing a piece of furniture that was sized for one person and resulted in a certain amount of adjustment, and she did not apologize for taking up the space she took up because she had finished apologizing for that a long time ago. He put his arm around her. The fire settled. Outside Iron Ridge Ranch was doing what it did in April evenings. The sounds of the animals and the wind, and the particular creak of buildings that have weathered winters and are beginning to feel the loosening of spring, all the sounds of a working place that does not stop for the feelings of the people inside it, but accommodates those feelings nonetheless, quietly, in the way that places do when enough life has been put into them. Well, they were married in May at the ranch, in the practical way of two people who did not need ceremony to confirm what was already true. Foss came. Purvis came and stood in the way Purvis stood at things, solidly and without comment. Eddie came and could barely contain himself, which was the most visible emotion she had seen from him and which she found genuinely touching. Walt wore a clean shirt and stood up straight and looked for the first time like the man he was in the process of becoming. Even Hobart came and shook her hand afterward with the directness of a man paying a real debt. Clara Baines sent a gift and a note that was this time straightforwardly warm, which Maggie received charitably because people were allowed to revise their estimates. She wore a dress she had ordered from Cheyenne, not elaborate, not the thing Clara Baines might have imagined, but well made and in a color that suited her, and she had not worried about what size it was in the way she once would have. She wore it because she liked it. That was sufficient. There were no speeches, which she had specifically requested. There was food, which Walt and she had cooked together on the morning of, and which was good, not perfect, not Rose's biscuits or anyone else's standard, but theirs, made in a kitchen that was genuinely theirs now. She stood in the yard afterward with Nate beside her and looked at Iron Ridge Ranch in the May sunshine and thought, I did not plan this. She thought, I planned to survive. I planned to work. I planned to use what my father gave me and make something with it. She had not planned any particular shape for what that something would be. She had come west as a large, plain woman from Boston with $4 in a notebook and the particular stubbornness of someone who has been told enough times that they are not enough and has quietly decided the telling is incorrect. She had been laughed at on a road, in a yard, at a table. She had been assessed and dismissed and measured against standards she did not fit, and she had done her work anyway. The books, the kitchens, the plans in the dark, the testimony in the courtroom, the Thursday evenings with Eddie, the careful management of a fence line and a water pipe and a supply contract, and a prisoner in a conversation with a man who was carrying grief and learning to set some of it down. This was what she had built with what she had. This was what the work looked like when you did it honestly and kept doing it when the ground was uncertain and did not wait for someone to make the ground certain before you stepped onto it. She thought about the woman on the stage road in September with her journal and her wrong shoes and her decision to keep walking west. That woman had known something the rest of the world had not caught up to yet. She had known she was worth the distance, worth the 40 minutes in the cold, worth the 30-day trial, worth the dark kitchen and the bad cot and the ledger that revealed the lies hidden inside it, worth the argument with Hobart and the patience with Walt and the careful construction of a plan that held when the danger came, worth every inch of the space she took up. She had always been worth it. The world had simply needed time to do the accounting. And Margaret Whitmore, bookkeeper, cook, foreman of Iron Ridge Ranch, daughter of a man who believed in the honesty of numbers, woman who had walked west and not stopped walking, had been patient enough to let it catch up. She looked at Nate, who was talking to Purvis about the south pasture fence and gesturing in the particular way he gestured when he was talking about something that needed doing, and she thought, this is a life I built. This is a life I chose. This is the one that was always waiting at the end of the road I refused to stop walking. She picked up her coffee from the porch rail and went inside to check on the food, because there were people to feed and the work did not pause for any occasion, and that was exactly the way she wanted it.